I want you to think about something for a second. Not about aliens, not about space, not about any of the big dramatic stuff that came later. Just think about a room. A room full of people who have already made up their minds, where the decision is done before anyone sits down, where the vote is just a formality, a rubber stamp, a thing you do so you can say you did it. You ever been in one of those rooms? Now imagine that room is the size of a small moon. That's what the Galactic Senate chamber looked like, or at least that's how I've come to picture it based on the testimony of the people who were there. 1,200 meters from floor to ceiling dome, 47 species represented. Each delegation seated in a tiered arc that stretched so far back you needed optical enhancement just to see the last row. The air was different in different sections. Humidity adjusted, oxygen ratios tuned, atmospheric pressure modulated by section, so that creatures who breathed methane sat behind sealed partitions and creatures who needed zero gravity floated in their containment spheres near the top. It was the most expensive room in the known galaxy. And in that room, on the 14th day of what the Galactic Standard Calendar called the Third Accord convening, 46 out of 47 empires voted to authorize an attack on a small, unremarkable planet in the Orion Arm. They voted to attack Earth. The 47th empire, the one that refused, was smaller than most. Didn't have a war fleet worth mentioning. Didn't have resource deposits that anyone coveted. Didn't have political allies in the chamber who owed them favors. By every standard calculation of galactic power politics, they had absolutely nothing to gain by standing up and nothing to lose by sitting down. Their representative stood up anyway. His name, transliterated, best approximation, was Velsaron of the Cathara Compact. He was 7 feet tall, pale as old bone, with 4 arms and eyes that reflected light like a cat's. He had been a diplomat for 63 years. He had attended 22 Senate convocations. He had never once cast a dissenting vote on a motion that had already achieved supermajority consensus. He stood up and said, in a voice that carried across all 1,200 meters, "The Cathara Compact votes no." And the room went very, very quiet. I wasn't there. I want to be clear about that. I'm piecing this together from sources, from the testimonies that were collected later, from the transmission archives, from the personal logs of 3 senators who agreed to speak on record. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the story. And the story starts with why they wanted to attack Earth in the first place. The official reason, the one recorded in the Senate transcript, the one that was cited in the motion, was a phrase I had to look up. Uncalibrated civilizational trajectory, which sounds like bureaucratic nothing-speak, but actually means something specific in galactic diplomatic context. It means your civilization is developing in a way that the rest of us can't predict, and unpredictable civilizations are dangerous civilizations, and dangerous civilizations need to be handled before they become a problem we can't handle. That was the official reason. The real reason was simpler. Humans had, within the span of approximately 80 years, gone from a species that hadn't yet achieved basic interstellar travel to a species that had independently developed 3 different forms of FTL drive, established colonies on 6 worlds, and most alarming to the empires assembled in that chamber, started winning fights they had no right winning. Fights against species that had been spacefaring for 10,000 years. There had been incidents, confrontations, border disputes that turned into something more. The Terran Exploration Corps had run into Vrethian patrol vessels near the edge of contested space 3 times in 4 years, and 3 times the Vrethians, who had a warfleet the size of a small planet and a military tradition going back 8 millennia, had come away from those encounters with significantly fewer ships than they'd started with. The Vrethian ambassador was one of the first to sign the attack motion. Then there was the Kalthari situation, which most humans don't even know about because the Terran government classified it for 30 years. A human mining operation near the Kalthari border had been seized, ships impounded, crew detained, equipment confiscated. Standard imperial expansion behavior, the kind of thing the Kalthari had been doing to smaller species for centuries. Nobody had ever pushed back. The Terran government pushed back. They sent 2 diplomatic vessels and 1 escort frigate. The escort frigate was called the TES Adamant, and when the Kalthari fleet commander at the border station refused to release the detained crew, the Adamant's captain broadcast a message on open channel that has since become somewhat famous. She said, "I'm going to ask you once more, politely. After that, I'm going to stop being polite." The Kalthari fleet commander laughed. He had 18 warships. The Adamant was 1 frigate. What happened next is still classified in full detail, but the summary that was eventually released stated that the detained crew was released in good order, and the Kalthari vessels present were encouraged to withdraw. The Adamant walked away from that encounter with hull damage on 3 decks and a functioning weapons array. The Kalthari lost 7 ships. The Kalthari ambassador was the second to sign the attack motion. By the time the convening was called, there was already a consensus. The humans were growing too fast, developing too fast, fighting back too readily and too effectively. The empires that had run galactic space for millennia looked at the trajectory lines on their predictive models. The exponential curves of human technological development, human population expansion, human military capacity, and they saw a species that, within 2 or 3 centuries, would be impossible to stop. So the logic, as presented by the motion's primary sponsors, was coldly practical. Stop them now, while they're still small, while the math still works in your favor, while you can still afford the cost. This is not an act of aggression, the Vrethian ambassador said during the floor presentation. This is an act of management. What we do today protects stability for 10,000 years. The cost is 1 world. The benefit is continued galactic peace. 1 world. Like it was nothing. Like there weren't 8 billion people going about their lives on that 1 world, having breakfast, arguing with their families, falling in love, making plans, planting gardens, teaching their children. Like those 8 billion people were an accounting entry that you write off for the sake of a spreadsheet. The empires in that room, most of them, didn't think of humans as people in any full sense. They thought of humans the way you think of a predator you see in the distance, with respect for its danger, with wariness about its potential, and with a very practical willingness to eliminate the threat before it becomes unmanageable. That's what 46 empires voted for. And then Vel Saron of the Kithara Compact stood up. Chapter 2, The Man Who Stood Up. I tracked down one of the junior aides who was part of the Kithara delegation that day. Her name, transliterated, is something close to Thessaly, and she's been living in a kind of informal diplomatic exile since the events of that convening. She agreed to talk to me over a secure channel, and she talked for 4 hours. This is what she told me. "We knew what was going to happen before we arrived," she said. The ambassador had received the preliminary signatory list. He knew the motion had enough votes to pass. Everyone did. The question that was circulating among the delegations, not openly but quietly in the corridors at the receptions, was not whether it would pass. The question was whether anyone would object. And the secondary question was whether an objection would even matter. "Did you know he was going to vote no?" I asked. She paused for a long time before answering. "I suspected," she said. "He had been different in the days before the vote, quieter than usual. He spent a lot of time reviewing the human cultural archives that had been submitted as part of the pre-motion documentation. Every species that comes before the Senate for any kind of action, they have to submit documentation. Background, history. The human submission was enormous. 10,000 years of recorded history, art, science, music, philosophy, war, recovery, literature. Mathematical proofs, medical breakthroughs, A list of their extinct species and the efforts they'd made to preserve them. Their own failures, and what they'd learned from those failures. He read all of it. He read all of it, and he watched the attached media files. I walked past his quarters on the third night and the door was open slightly and I could hear. I didn't recognize it at first, but I looked it up later. It was music, human music, something old from one of their historical periods, orchestral, very big. I don't have a better word. The sound was very big. She stopped talking for a moment. He was crying, she said, or the Ketharan equivalent of it. I've worked with him for 11 years and I'd never seen that before. What Velsaron said on the Senate floor, the full speech, not just the vote, was also part of the archive. It was in the original Ketharan dialect, and the translation I'm working from has been reviewed by 3 separate xenolinguists for accuracy. So what follows is as close to his actual words as we can get. He said, I have served this Senate for 63 years. I have voted in support of 41 resolutions. I have abstained 6 times. I have never in those 63 years found reason to cast a dissenting vote on a motion that has already achieved the consensus of this body. I understand what such a vote means in practical terms. I understand that the Kethara Compact's voice is small here. I understand that my no will not stop this motion. I understand all of this. And I vote no anyway. Because I have spent the last 7 days reviewing what humanity is. Not what they might become, not what our predictive models say about their trajectory, what they are right now today as a civilization. They are, I want to be precise here because precision matters, they are a species that nearly destroyed themselves, multiple times, by their own hand. They fought wars of such catastrophic scale that entire regions of their planet became uninhabitable. They developed weapons capable of ending their entire civilization and then stopped, put those weapons away, not because they couldn't use them, not because they were forced to, because enough of them decided that the cost was too high. They built empires and watched them fall. They enslaved each other and then abolished it, not in a generation, not without pain, but over centuries of incremental, bloody, difficult moral progress. They made mistakes of such staggering magnitude that entire peoples nearly ceased to exist, and they, not all of them, not quickly, not without enormous internal struggle, learned. They built institutions to try to prevent the same mistakes from happening again. Imperfect institutions, frequently failing institutions. But institutions that exist because they kept trying. This is not the profile of an uncalibrated civilization. This is the profile of a civilization that has been calibrating itself for 10,000 years, in the harshest possible laboratory, their own survival. And you want to end it because they fight back. There was silence on the Senate floor after that last line. 4 seconds of silence, which, in a chamber of that size and that composition, is remarkable. Later recordings captured it clearly. You want to end it because they fight back, he repeated. Because they don't lie down. Because when you take their ships, they take your ships back. Because when you threaten them, they look at the threat and calculate, and then they decide whether or not to be afraid, and sometimes, most alarmingly, they decide not to be. You call this dangerous. I call this admirable. The Kethara Compact votes no. We will not sign this motion. We will not participate in this action. And if, when history is written about what this Senate did today, I want it recorded that at least one voice in this chamber said, this is wrong. What you are proposing is wrong, not strategically wrong, not tactically inadvisable, morally wrong, and I won't have the compact's name on it. He sat down. The motion passed anyway. 46-1. Chapter 3, The Admiral. Here's where the story shifts, because the Senate vote was just a vote. What came after the vote was a fleet. The combined action fleet that the 46 signing empires assembled was, by any measure, the largest coordinated military force in the known galaxy's history since the collapse wars 4,000 years prior. I've seen the numbers. I've verified them against 3 separate sources. 247 warships, 14 dedicated carrier vessels, 43 troop transports, enough combined firepower to reduce a planet the size of Earth to rubble in roughly 6 hours. They weren't planning to reduce Earth to rubble exactly. The motion specified a subduing action, which is a diplomatic term that means you crack the shell enough to break resistance without destroying the underlying resources. You want compliance, not a graveyard. You want a planet that you can use. So they weren't going to kill everyone. Just enough people, enough infrastructure, enough of the military capacity, until the humans understood that there was no point in fighting back anymore. The fleet was commanded by a Vrethian admiral named Gret Call. He was, by Vrethian standards, both experienced and celebrated. He'd commanded 6 major actions in his career, won all 6, and was known in Vrethian military circles for being methodical, patient, and extremely thorough. He planned his operations down to the last detail. He ran simulations until the numbers told him exactly what he needed. He was not the kind of commander who got surprised. He was about to get surprised. The fleet assembled at a staging point 6 light days from Earth system. That was in the record. What was also in the record, and what I found remarkable, was that the humans knew they were coming. Not everything, not the exact composition, not the precise timing, but they knew. They'd had eyes on the border space long enough to know that something was building, and they'd spent the months between the Senate vote, which they were aware of through a source I'll get to in a moment, and the fleet's arrival doing something that Admiral Gret Call's models had not accounted for. Preparing. Not in the way that makes sense on paper. The numbers were impossible. 247 warships against Earth's combined defense fleet of less than 40. Against those odds, preparation looks like futility. It looks like going through the motions before the inevitable. But the humans have this, I don't know what to call it, it's a cultural thing, a deeply embedded behavioral pattern that shows up in their history over and over. When the odds are worst, when the math is most against them, there's a subset of them who get very calm, very focused, very practical. Like the situation filters out everything except the essential question, what can we actually do? And they start doing it. The source who warned Earth about the vote was Vel Saron. I'll let that sit for a moment. He'd cast his dissenting vote. He'd given his speech. He'd done everything within the formal diplomatic channels that he could do. And then, 11 days before the fleet assembled, he sent a transmission, encrypted, routed through 3 relay stations to obscure the origin, to the Terran diplomatic mission that maintained a small office on the neutral station at Gethara's Cross. The transmission contained 2 things: the full Senate vote record, including the complete text of every empire's stated justification, and a personal note in Ketharan, which the Terran diplomatic staff had translated. The note said, "I could not stop them. I am sorry. I wanted you to know that I tried, and I wanted you to know that I genuinely believe that you deserve better than what they are sending. Use this time as wisely as you can." He signed it with his full name and title. He was expelled from the Galactic Senate 6 days later for breach of diplomatic confidentiality. His credentials were revoked. The Kethara Compact was suspended from all trade agreements and stripped of its Senate observer status. He never expressed regret about any of it. Not once, in any interview, in any public statement, in anything recorded before his death 14 years later. Chapter 4, 40 Ships. Let me tell you about Commander Yara Osimensa. She was 44 years old at the time of the engagement. She'd been in the Terran Exploration Corps for 22 years, started as a junior navigator on a science vessel, worked her way up through about 6 different postings, had a reputation for being blunt to the point of occasional insubordination, and brilliant to the point of people putting up with the occasional insubordination. She'd been involved in both the Vrethian border incidents and the Kalthari situation. She had more first-hand combat experience with alien military forces than anyone else in the Terran fleet. She was given command of Earth's defensive response. Not because she was the highest-ranking officer available, she wasn't. But because she was the one who, when the Terran High Command assembled its crisis council and looked around the room and asked, "Who understands these people?" She was the one who'd sat across the table from them, who'd looked at their ships through a targeting scope, who understood in a visceral, practical way how they thought. She got the command and spent most of the intervening weeks doing something that surprised a lot of people. She talked to Velsaron. Not directly. He was under communication monitoring by then, his transmissions reviewed by Senate security, but through the diplomatic back channels that Terran intelligence had established with the Cathara Compact mission staff. Thessaly, actually, the same person I interviewed later, messages were exchanged. Questions about fleet composition, about Vrethian tactical doctrine, about the individual captains of the major warships in the assembled fleet, their records, their tendencies, their reported weaknesses. Velsaron answered every question as completely as he could. Through cutouts and encrypted relays and third-party intermediaries, at considerable personal risk, he walked the woman commanding Earth's defense through everything he knew about the fleet coming to crush it. When I asked Thessaly about this, she said quietly, he knew it probably wouldn't be enough. The numbers were too bad, but he told me this directly, he thought that if even one ship survived, if even one crew made it out, then at least the universe would know that Earth fought. That someone stood up for them, that it wasn't over without a mark being left. He wanted them to leave a mark. The fleet arrived at Earth's outer system on a Tuesday. Human Tuesday. I mention that because it matters somehow, the specific, mundane particularity of a Tuesday. People were commuting. Schools were in session. Somewhere in Sao Paulo, someone was arguing with a delivery driver about a missed package. Somewhere in Edinburgh, a woman was deciding what to have for lunch. Ordinary Tuesday things. The Terran Defense Network flagged the fleet's arrival 40 minutes before its forward elements crossed the heliopause. That was the sensor infrastructure that had been quietly upgraded in the months since the warning. Velsaron's information had specified the fleet's probable approach vector, and the sensor upgrades had been concentrated along that vector, giving Earth 40 minutes of warning that it wouldn't otherwise have had. 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, Commander Osimensa deployed her ships in a formation that Admiral Gretkal had never seen before. Not because it was particularly exotic. It was derived from a combination of Vrethian doctrine, which she'd studied, and Kalthari defensive formation theory, which she'd experienced firsthand from the inside, adapted for human vessels' particular combination of speed and weapons range. When the Admiral's fleet cleared the outer system, and his sensors gave him his first good look at the defensive formation, he paused. The record from his command vessel shows a 4-minute gap in transmission activity after the sensor report came in. 4 minutes in which he apparently said nothing and ordered nothing. His chief of staff later described what happened during those 4 minutes. The Admiral studied the defensive formation. He had it projected in 3 dimensions in the command center. He walked around it. He asked 2 questions. The first question was, who designed this? The second question was, why haven't I seen this before? Chapter 5, The Engagement. I want to be honest with you about something. The engagement itself, the battle, if you want to call it that, though that word almost undersells what it was, I can't give you a complete tactical picture. The full records are still classified on both sides. What I have is testimony, fragments, the pieces that people were willing to share. But the picture those pieces make is extraordinary. The first exchange happened at long range. Standard doctrine for a fleet action at that scale: you probe, you assess, you feel out the defensive strength before you commit to close engagement. Gretkal sent forward elements. Standard Vrethian strike formation, textbook execution. They did not perform as expected. The human defensive line didn't hold steady. It moved. It absorbed the strike formation's approach, and then, this is the word multiple witnesses used, from both sides, folded around it. Like a hand closing. The strike formation found itself bracketed on three sides by concentrated fire from angles that their formation hadn't accounted for, and before the recall order could be transmitted, 4 of the 7 forward element vessels were either destroyed or critically damaged. Gretkal pulled back his forward elements. He ran new simulations. He sent a different formation. It also did not perform as expected. The human formation had moved again. It had adapted. It was doing something that Vrethian tactical doctrine didn't have a name for, because Vrethian tactical doctrine was built around engagements with opponents who held position, who followed predictable doctrine, who fought in ways that could be modeled and anticipated. The humans were not doing any of those things. Osai was running her defensive formation in real time, responding to each probe, each adjustment, each tactical shift, with countershifts that her fleet executed at a speed that the Vrethian observers found deeply unsettling. Later accounts from Vrethian officers who were there described her fleet's movements as organic, which is, for a Vrethian, a word that carries connotations of something almost biological, something that grows and responds rather than follows a predetermined pattern. They weren't fighting a defensive formation. They were fighting something that was thinking at them. 3 hours into the engagement, Gretkal sent a full-strength assault. This is the part that I've tried hardest to reconstruct from the fragments, because this is the part that, I think, is the most important. He sent 211 warships in a coordinated assault. He held back 36 in reserve. He covered multiple approach vectors simultaneously so that the human formation would be forced to split its attention and resources. By every model he had, this assault should have broken the defensive line in 40 minutes. It took longer than 40 minutes. Commander Osai formation did split. It had to. There was no way to cover all the vectors without splitting, but it split in a way that Gretkal hadn't anticipated, into subsections that maintained communication and coordination with each other even while engaging separate portions of his fleet. His assault, instead of hitting a fragmenting defense, found itself engaging what felt like multiple independent formations that were also somehow acting in concert. 4 hours in, he had taken significant losses. Not catastrophic, he still had the numbers to win, he knew it, his tactical team confirmed it. But the losses were running far above any model he'd built, and there was something else happening that his officers began reporting to him with increasing urgency. His ships were making mistakes. Not tactical errors, the ship's crews were performing well, executing their orders with discipline and competence, but they were making decision errors under pressure. Hesitation at moments when Vrethian doctrine called for aggression. Aggression at moments when caution would have served better. The human engagement style was creating constant small pressure points, constant micro-decisions under fire, and the sheer frequency of those decisions was wearing on crew performance in ways that the pre-engagement models hadn't accounted for. One of Gretkal's wing commanders, speaking to him over command channel during the 4th hour, said something that ended up in the record. "Admiral, I don't understand what I'm fighting. My crew doesn't understand what we're fighting. We know where their ships are. We don't know what their ships are going to do." That right there, that's the thing the models didn't have a variable for. I asked Osai about this when I finally got an interview with her, years later. She was retired by then, living on the coast somewhere, and she agreed to talk on the condition that I not name the location. She was quieter than I'd expected, more thoughtful. There was something careful about her, the way she chose words. I asked her what she'd been doing during those first 4 hours, what was in her head, what her decision process looked like. She looked at the water for a while before she answered. "You know what I kept thinking about," she said. "I kept thinking about my mother. My mother grew up in a place where there was a time when the odds against her were not so different from the odds against us. In different ways, obviously, but she told me something once. She said, "Yara, when you can't win the fight they're planning, make them fight a different fight." She wasn't talking about anything military. She was talking about something completely different, something in her own life. But I thought about it all the time during those hours. Make them fight a different fight. Every time they sent a formation, I tried not to respond to the formation they sent. I tried to make them respond to me, even if I was the smaller force, even if I was losing ships. I tried to make the shape of the battle something other than what they'd planned for, because they were very good at the battle they'd planned for. I didn't know if we could be good enough at the battle they'd planned for. But a battle nobody planned for, that's equal footing in a way. Everyone's improvising. Everyone's making decisions under pressure. And humans under pressure, under genuine survival pressure, we've had a lot of practice at that. She paused. The universe is very big, she said, and most of the things that live in it haven't had to fight for their existence in the same way we have. Not for this long. Not continuously. Not against everything at once, disease and climate and each other and our own worst instincts. We've been training for this fight our entire evolutionary history. We didn't know that until the universe showed up at our door, but we have been. Chapter 6. The Hour It Changed. 6 hours and 17 minutes into the engagement, something happened that Admiral Gretkall had not planned for and could not have. 3 human vessels, the TES Principia, the TES Covenant, and the frigate Steadfast, broke formation. Not retreating. Not damaged. They broke from the defensive line and drove directly into the gap between the Admiral's left flank and his reserve element, through an approach angle that required them to run through a corridor of combined fire from 6 Vrethian warships. All 3 ships took serious damage making that run. They made it through. They came out the other side of that corridor, in a position where they had a direct engagement angle on the flagships of 3 separate Empire delegations in the combined fleet. The Vrethian command vessel, the Kalthari fleet carrier, and the Ortheni dreadnought that represented the most militarily capable of the smaller signing empires. From that position, the 3 human ships transmitted a communication, not on the command channel, on every open channel the fleet used simultaneously. The communication was from Commander Osimensa, and it was not a demand, not a threat, not a surrender request in reverse. It was a question. She said, "Do you understand yet what this is costing you? We have counted your losses. You have lost 31 ships. You have damaged another 47. You have been in this engagement for over 6 hours and the defensive line behind me is still there. We are 40 ships. You are 211. By your own models, this should have been over in less than an hour. I want you to think about what that means, not strategically, not tactically, what it means. And then I want you to think about what happens in 20 years, in 50 years, in 100, when we're not 40 ships, when we've built what you're afraid we're going to build, when there are humans on 1,000 worlds and in 1,000 fleets. Think about whether you want those humans to remember this day as the day you tried to end them, or as the day you decided not to. My name is Commander Yara Osimensa of the Terran Exploration Corps. I am defending my home. I will defend it until I am no longer able to. But I am asking you, I am asking the commanders of those fleets, the representatives of those empires, to consider whether what you came here to do is worth it. Not whether you can do it. I know you can. I'm not deluded about the numbers. But whether it is worth it. Silence on every channel. The 3 human ships held their position. They were deeply damaged, all 3 of them. Weapons at partial capacity. Shield systems degraded. The Steadfast had lost 2 decks to atmosphere breach. The Principia's captain, according to the later record, was running the ship from auxiliary control because the main bridge had taken a direct hit. They held their position. The Kalthari fleet carrier was the first to respond. Its commander, not the ambassador, but the flag admiral in charge of the Kalthari military contribution to the combined fleet sent a response on command channel to Admiral Gretkal, not to Osimensa. The message, recovered and translated, was short. "This is Kethara Sorm, commanding the Kalthari Expeditionary Element. I am withdrawing my ships from this engagement. The Kalthari contingent entered this action under the understanding that resistance would be minimal and the action brief. What I have witnessed over the past 6 hours does not match that understanding. I am exercising my command authority to withdraw the Kalthari element pending reassessment." Gretkal responded immediately, demanding compliance with fleet orders. Kethara Sorm replied, "These are not fleet orders. This is a coalition. I joined this coalition voluntarily and I am leaving it voluntarily. The terms of the Senate motion did not strip me of independent command authority. Do not attempt to impede the withdrawal of my ships." The Kalthari contingent, 48 warships, began to withdraw. That was the crack in the dam. It didn't come all at once. These things never do. But over the next 40 minutes, 3 more Empire contingents signaled withdrawal or stand down. The Orthony element held a command consultation among its senior officers and then transmitted a ceasefire indication. 2 of the smaller Empire contingents, species I won't name because their roles in the original vote were complex and contested, simply stopped engaging without transmitting anything. By the time Gretkal broadcast a fleet-wide order demanding that the action continue, he was commanding maybe 60% of the ships he'd had an hour before. He continued. Because he was Vrethian, and Vrethian military commanders don't stop. Because he still had the numbers. Because the order was the order, and the mission was the mission, and Vrethian doctrine doesn't include vocabulary for reconsider. The engagement continued for another 3 hours. In those 3 hours, the combined fleet, now reduced, unsynchronized, with half its elements in various states of withdrawal or hesitation, took losses that were not survivable from a coalition standpoint. Not because Earth's defense suddenly became unstoppable. The Principia was destroyed in the 7th hour. The Steadfast went dark in hour 8. Earth lost 12 more ships in those 3 hours. But the cohesion of the attacking fleet was gone. The operational momentum was gone. What had been a coordinated, purpose-built military action was now a fragmented collection of national contingents following conflicting orders and watching each other for cues about what to do next. And the human defensive line was still there. Chapter 7, GRETHKOL. Here is what I believe happened in Gretkal's command center in the 9th hour of the engagement, based on the recovered records and the later testimony of 2 of his surviving officers. He looked at his tactical display. He looked at the numbers. He ran them again because he was a thorough man, a meticulous man, the kind of commander who ran numbers twice. Then he sat down, and there's a record of the exact moment because his biometric harness logged it, and he was still for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. His chief of staff said to him carefully that perhaps the fleet should be repositioned for a continued assault the following day, giving the withdrawing elements time to recommit, regrouping. Gretkal didn't answer immediately. When he answered, he said, "She was right." The chief of staff asked him to clarify. "The human commander," she said, "do you understand what this is costing you?" "I didn't want to understand it." He paused. "I understand it now." He transmitted a fleet-wide ceasefire order, then a stand-down, then a withdrawal. He never commanded another military operation. He resigned his commission within 6 months of returning to Vrethian space. There's a record of an interview he gave to a Vrethian historical archive 10 years later, in which he said something that I've thought about many times. He said, "I went to that system to end a civilization. What I found instead was, I don't have the vocabulary for it. The word in our language that comes closest is a word we use for materials that have been forged under pressure into something harder than they started as. I went to break something and I found something that had already been broken many times and had learned to become stronger at the breaking points. I've thought about it for 10 years, and I still don't know that I was wrong to be afraid of them. I was wrong about what to do with the fear. Chapter 8. After. The aftermath took years to fully resolve, and in some ways it's still resolving, decades later. The Galactic Senate reconvened within 3 months of the withdrawal. The political situation was complicated. The 46 empires that had signed the attack motion were now in various states of internal debate, diplomatic fallout with each other over the withdrawal controversy, and nervous reassessment of their long-term relationship with humanity. The Vrethian contingent, still commanded nominally by Gretkal until his resignation, had taken the heaviest losses of any element in the combined fleet. The Vrethian Senate debated the failure for 2 years before reaching conclusions that were never publicly released in full. The Kalthari, interestingly, came out of it relatively well, politically speaking. Cathara Sorm's decision to withdraw had been criticized within the Kalthari military establishment, but had been ultimately vindicated by the outcome. He became a moderating voice in Kalthari-Terran relations over the following decade. The Cathara Compact had its Senate status restored within 4 years. The trade agreements took longer, about 8 years before they were fully back in place. Velsaron did not live to see all of them restored, but he saw most of it. When asked repeatedly by various journalists and historians whether he regretted losing his credentials, losing his career standing, being expelled from the institution he'd served for 6 decades, he always gave the same answer. He said, "I did the right thing. I know I did because the alternative was something I couldn't live with. That's usually how you know." The Terran Diplomatic Accord, signed in year 3 post-engagement, established the formal framework for Earth's relationship with the galactic community. It took 4 years of negotiation and roughly 100 separate sub-agreements to produce a document that everyone hated approximately equally, which is the diplomatic indicator for a workable treaty. Earth got recognition, trade access. A seat at the galactic table, not a full Senate seat, not yet, but an observer status with speaking rights. It was less than it should have been and more than anyone had expected given the circumstances of the introduction. Commander Yara Osaimensa was the lead Terran negotiator for 6 months of those talks before she rotated out and turned the role over to the professional diplomats. She was awarded the highest military honor the Terran Exploration Corps could give. She declined to have her name on anything built after her while she was still alive, which was a preference she maintained until her death 30 years later, at which point several things were named after her anyway. She's the reason I'm writing this. Not because she asked me to, she never asked me to, but because she told me something at the end of our interview that I've been trying to find the right way to pass on since then, and I think this is the right way. Chapter 9. What she said. She'd been quiet for a while. The interview had been going for 2 hours. Outside the window wherever she was, there was the sound of water. I never knew if it was a lake or an ocean. She never specified, but it was consistent and calming and very much present in the recording I made. I asked her the question I'd been building toward for the whole 2 hours. I asked her, when you knew what was coming, when you knew the numbers, when you were looking at 247 warships, what did you think? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I thought about the Accord of Westphalia." I admitted I didn't immediately know what she meant. "It's a peace agreement," she said. "From Earth history, 1648, ended a series of wars that had been going on for a long time. It wasn't a perfect agreement. Everybody who signed it gave up something they didn't want to give up. Everybody who signed it got something they needed. It's remembered now as one of the foundations of the concept of sovereignty, the idea that a state has the right to determine its own internal affairs without external interference. The idea that size doesn't automatically confer the right to dictate to your neighbors. I thought about that agreement when I was looking at 247 warships. I thought, this is the same argument. It's the same argument it's always been. The big people say, we know better. We know what's good for the whole. Your existence threatens the stability we've built. And the small people say, we exist. We have the right to exist. And sometimes, not always, not enough times in history, but sometimes, the small people make the case clearly enough and at cost enough that the argument lands. She paused. I didn't save Earth, she said. My ships didn't save Earth. We couldn't have. The math was wrong for that. What we did, what I think we did, was make the argument. The same argument that Velsaron made in that Senate chamber. The same argument that humans have been making to each other and to the universe for 10,000 years. We exist. We have the right to exist. And we will make that case in whatever way we have to. What saved Earth was that some of them listened. Catharasorm listened. Gretkal listened eventually. Enough of them listened. And that only happened because Velsaron, a person from a small empire with no strategic reason to care, stood up and said, this is wrong. He planted a seed. He took a real cost for it, a real personal cost, and the seed grew. I think about him a lot, she said. I've thought about him almost every day since then. I never met him in person. We exchanged messages through intermediaries. But I believe, as strongly as I believe anything, that whatever good came out of what happened in that system, the most important thing happened before a single shot was fired. It happened in a room the size of a small moon, when a pale man with 4 arms and cat eyes stood up and said no. That's the story, she said. All the rest of it is just what happened after that. Chapter 10, the last thing. There's one more thing I want to tell you. After Velsaron was expelled from the Senate, after his credentials were revoked, after the Compact's trade agreements were suspended, in those early months, when everything was uncertain and the fleet was assembling, and no one knew how any of it was going to end, he received a message. It came through the same intermediary network he'd used to send his warning. Through Thessaly, through the diplomatic back channels, through the careful cutout structure that had been built for exactly this kind of communication. The message was from Commander Osimensa, before the engagement, before the fleet arrived, before any of the fighting. The message was short. Thessaly told me about it and read me the translated text. It said, I received your warning. We are doing what we can with the time you gave us. I want you to know, whatever happens, that someone on this world knows your name. That someone on this world will remember what you did and will tell others. You are not alone in this. You were brave, thank you. Thessaly said that, when Velsaron received that message, he read it several times. And then he did something she'd never seen him do in 11 years. He laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a diplomatic laugh. A real one, full and surprised and genuine. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere unexpected inside you, from a place you didn't know was still there. What did he say? I asked. Thessaly was quiet for a moment. He said, they thanked me. Can you imagine that? In the middle of all of this, they found the time to say thank you. She paused. He said, of course they did. Of course they did. End of declassified record. This account is dedicated to the crew of the TES Principia, the TES Covenant, and the TES Steadfast, and to Velsaron of the Cathara Compact, who never carried a weapon, never commanded a ship, never fired a shot, and may have changed everything. The universe is full of empires. Now and then it produces someone who refuses. Remember their names.